pleasure to have a conversation today with Dr. Thea Cacchioni for the 2021 President's Dream Colloquium and for the 50th anniversary celebration of the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University. Dr. Cacchioni, it is such a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we get going, I just wanted to recognize that I'm taking part in this conversation from my home, which is located on the unceded territory of the Stalo Nation.
And I'm taking part in this conversation from my home on unceded Lekwungen territory. And the Esquimalt, Songhees, and Wasanich people continue to have a relationship with this land to this day.
Thank you. So it's not every day that I get to have a conversation with somebody who has testified at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So in your own words, how would you like to introduce us to your work?
Okay, well, I was long interested in the ways in which science, medicine, psychiatry, and then later I came to Big Pharma, kind of have shaped ideas about sex, gender, race, class, and sexuality. And that kind of interest of mine is a through line from my MA to my PhD and beyond. My initial work on that area was during my MA dissertation when I traced discourses of promiscuity and sex and gender in psychiatry and popular psychology from the 19th century to the present. And I really noticed how psychiatrists, as well as more popular psychologists, were really pathologizing female promiscuity in ways that they weren't for males. And this also differed across lines of class and race as well. And so that was my initial kind of entry into the subject of medicalization, the growing power of these experts to really shape our understandings as lay people of what is healthy, what is sick, what is deviant, what is normal, all of those things. And then when I went to do my PhD research, it was at the time when Viagra had just kind of emerged onto markets as one of the most successful blockbuster drugs in history. And I was very interested in the ways in which it was being positioned in relation to sex and gender. So it was very much kind of framed around successful masculinity, you know, linking that to erections and guaranteed erections. And so I started to trace these kinds of popular discourses about this drug, because this was an example of a drug that became part of the kind of popular culture discussion in a kind of broad sense. And at the time, they were speculating that if there was such a drug for females, or people assigned female at birth, as I would say, but they wouldn't, they would say women, that this would be even a bigger market, because in their view, women had even more sexual problems than men. And so I started to really trace this discourse and look at the ways in which it's kind of underpinning assumptions that this apparently objective, value-free, scientific medical discourse was giving us. And also looking at the relationships between big pharma and doctors, and really learning a lot about how close that relationship is, and how it is now really this private industry of the pharmaceutical companies that are driving medicalization more so than individual doctors or hospitals. So I started to do that work of kind of noting these shifting discourses on sexual dysfunction, as it was now being titled, because the term frigidity was no longer seen as acceptable. So now we have this new, seemingly more neutral term of female sexual dysfunction. And along the way, certain drugs started to emerge as potentially going up for approval. And the second one to do so was a drug called flibanserin, which is now branded as Addy. And I went in 2010 to the FDA to testify against this drug. This was right before I started my chair in the department, the Ruth Wynn Woodward chair. So I went with a group of other scholars and activists and doctors who were concerned about a drug that was very ineffective and also had some real risks to it. And I think it was kind of interesting that as a gender studies scholar, I could testify at this American drug trial. This would not be possible in the Health Canada setting, which is very closed doors. And actually, I find quite interesting, they refer to the drug companies as their clients in the Health Canada setting. So I think this is an area we have to work on. So I testified kind of from this social constructionist point of view, which is not typically what you see at a drug trial, but I just mentioned, first of all, the diagnosis that this drug claims to treat is highly contested, and these are the reasons why. And there's many social, political, economic reasons why anyone may have low desire, which is what the drug was claiming to treat, including low desire just being a normal part of life, just as desire is. And I talked about how even the very medicalized American Psychiatric Association's DSM, one of the most medicalizing kind of pathologizing texts, even they had moved to strike the desire part out of the female sexual dysfunction diagnosis. And that caused a lot of paper shuffling and concerned looks among the panel because they actually weren't aware of that. And you have to have a valid diagnosis for a drug to be approved. So I mentioned things like this, and just also the way that norms of sexuality vary from era to era and culture to culture, and how would we ever really pinpoint this empirical baseline level. And that was my work there. And I went back another time for another hearing as well, which I can tell you about another time. But just in terms of where this fits into my broader work, which is what you asked about, and I'm giving you a very long answer.
You're giving me a perfect answer.
I thought I would move. I wrote a book on this topic, published with U of T Press, many journal articles. I testified twice at the FDA. I kind of felt like, okay, I'm ready to move on to something else. And one thing that had always been percolating in my mind was that I have the polycystic ovarian syndrome diagnosis. And it's always been interesting to me because it's considered to be the most common endocrine disorder for people assigned female at birth. And yet doctors seem very confused about it. The name is actually very misleading for what the symptoms are, etc. But on the other hand, my interest from a gender studies point of view was it seemed to me that all the traits of polycystic ovarian syndrome are traits that would only be, for the most part, negative because they defy what is seen as celebrated femininity. So to give you an example, it would be like having a high body mass index, having acne, what they call hirsutism, hairiness, lack of menstruation, infertility. So if you put those together, you can see that the opposite is what is celebrated in terms of feminine sex and gender norms. And so I was very interested in this in relation to the social construction of gender and femininity. I was also interested in something I read in the Transgender World Professional WPATH Association for Transgender Health, which creates the standards of care for trans health globally. They made a statement in their recent standards of care saying there's a very high percentage of transmasculine people with PCOS, and that's in the absence also of taking testosterone. So I started to think, well, not everyone would necessarily have the same relationship with these so-called symptoms. And I'm not trying to say that there's a homogenous kind of trans relationship or a homogenous cis relationship with these symptoms, but just that, perhaps they differ depending on your very unique sex and gender identity. And so I see a lot of parallels with PCOS and intersex. I wouldn't say they're the same thing by any means. And intersex people have had much more invasive treatments by medical professionals, or I think treatments is an overly generous word, interventions, which are very violent. But this is also about kind of a non-binary biological sex presentation, or it can be. And so it's just interests me in so many ways, and I'm kind of surprised that so few people have been taking it up from a critical kind of gender studies, anti-racist, feminist kind of lens. And there's a lot of links that span my former research and this current research. And I think the two biggest things I could say is that number one, we already know it's been very historically established in gender studies that doctors historically and still today reinforce heteronormative scripts and kind of validate heteronormativity. But what I think my research studies show by interviewing lay people, which I've done in both studies through qualitative interviews, is that the social stigma of not fitting into a celebrated norm of biological sex and gender, and the social material consequences of that stigma can impel people towards medicalization. So that's one thing that really spans both, because in both studies I saw this incredible amount of work people were doing to try to seek help to conform more to these standards. And then another thing that really interested me is the ways in which we often talk about trans and non-binary identities in relation to the work of identity and any kind of interventions, whether they're pharmaceutical or cosmetic, that enhance that kind of sense of self. We often kind of ghettoize that research into trans and non-binary research. But I think what my two studies, which were very predominantly, they were almost all interviews with cisgender people, and the first study was very heterosexual, the second study not as much. But I think what these studies show is that the people who are conforming the most to heteronormativity and are identifying as cis and heterosexual are doing all of this hard identity work to conform, right? And so everyone is technologically mediated, as Susan Stryker, former Ruth Wynn Woodward chair, has talked about through the concept of somatechnics, trans somatechnics. And so there's this continuum. And I think in a kind of qualitative research sense, my work speaks to that as well.